In 1912, Forsyth County, Georgia was home to nearly 1,100 black residents. Roughly 220 households, farmers, renters, landowners, congregations living along the Chattahoochee River. Within 4 months, nearly all of them were gone. Not relocated, driven out by fire, by rope, by mobs in the thousands. And 44 years after that, the ground they were driven from disappeared too, put under 600 billion gallons of water, and quietly renamed a lake. This is the story of one valley in North Georgia, erased twice, once by people, once by water. Today it's called Lake Sidney Lanier, 38,000 acres of water, 692 miles of shoreline, the primary drinking water supply for a metro area of some 6 million people. 10 to 12 million people visit it every year. Almost none of them know what it's sitting on. We're going to tell you from the beginning. Before we go under the surface, if you want more sourced, real stories about the places America erased, subscribe now. This channel exists to find them. Forsyth County, Georgia, rolling hills north of Atlanta, along the banks of the Chattahoochee River. Red clay, cotton fields, a scatter of farming settlements nobody outside the county had ever heard of. Oscarville sat in the Newbridge district, right against the river, one of those settlements. It was never a formal town, no charter, no courthouse, no main street. A rural crossroads, farms, a church, a schoolhouse. In 1910, the census counted about 500 people in the district around it. 37 were black in 7 households, and exactly one of those households, a farmer named Garrett Cook, owned its land. Most of the county's black families lived elsewhere, spread across other districts, but Oscarville is where everything ignited. The Chattahoochee itself begins far north in the Blue Ridge Mountains and runs southwest for hundreds of miles, through what was, in 1911, still mostly farm country. In the decades after Reconstruction, the county's black community had built something rare for the Deep South at the time, a foothold that was genuinely growing. By 1911, Forsyth County's black population, just over 1,000 people, had built farms, churches, a school, and a landowning class of their own. By the 1910 census, at least 40 of those households owned their land outright. Some counts run closer to 60. In Jim Crow, Georgia, either number was almost unheard of. It had taken a generation of labor to build. It would take 4 months to destroy. Picture it before any of this happened. Cabins and clapboard houses along dirt roads, corn and cotton rows running down to the river, mule teams, a country church on a Sunday. None of that is a metaphor. It is a description of a real place. That place no longer physically exists anywhere, not as ruins, not as a ghost town you can walk through. It is entirely underwater. September 5th, 1912. A white woman named Ellen Grice claimed a black man had broken into her bedroom. 5 black men were arrested within days. No physical evidence was ever produced against any of them. 3 days later, on September 8th, an 18-year-old white woman named Mee Crow went missing near Cumming, the county seat. She was found the next morning in the woods, face down, her throat cut, barely alive. A 16-year-old named Ernest Knox was arrested that same day. Under interrogation, he confessed and named 2 others, Oscar Daniel, 17, and Rob Edwards, 24. The county sheriff moved Edwards to the jail, in coming for what should have been his own protection. Word of the arrest spread through the county within hours, by telephone, by rider, by rumor passed farm to farm. Rob Edwards never stood trial. That night, a mob estimated at 2,000 men surrounded the jail. They broke down the door and found Edwards in his cell. They beat him with a crowbar, they shot him repeatedly. Then they dragged his body through the streets to the town square and hanged it from a telephone pole in public view. No one was ever charged for his murder. Ernest Knox and Oscar Daniel were tried under martial law less than a month later, Georgia militia guarding the courthouse to prevent another lynching before the state could carry out its own. It was less a trial than a formality. The verdict, by every contemporary account, was never in real doubt. On October 4th, both defendants were sentenced to hang. On October 25th, they were publicly executed in Cumming. An estimated 5,000 to 8,000 people came to watch in a county whose total population was only around 12,000. Georgia in 1912 was in the middle of what historians now call the lynching era. Mob violence against Black Americans was common across the South then, and rarely, if ever, prosecuted. What made Forsyth County different wasn't the violence itself, it was what the violence was used to accomplish next. That was the spark, what came next was the fire. In the weeks after the hangings, armed white vigilantes, night riders, moved through the county after dark, farm to farm. They burned Black-owned homes, they burned at least one Black church to the ground. They nailed notices to doors giving families days, sometimes hours, to leave the county. Some families fled with a single wagon load of belongings. Others left in the middle of the night on foot, carrying only what their arms could hold. There was no army defending those families, and no court that would hear their case. There was only the road out. Families sold land worth years of labor for whatever a white neighbor was willing to offer that week, or they simply abandoned it and walked. Within 4 months, historians estimate that roughly 98% of the county's Black residents were gone. Newspapers and a later historical marker put the number driven out at approximately 1,098 people. For scale, that was roughly 10% of the entire county's population, gone in a single season. The county's Black community didn't vanish in a single night. It emptied household by household, church by church, until there was almost no one left. Some families made it as far as Athens, Georgia. Some went north to Atlanta. Some kept going and never came back to the state at all. They left behind more than buildings. They left behind cleared fields, wells, fence lines, graves, the entire physical record of a community, standing empty under the Georgia sun. What happened next is its own kind of vanishing, not of land, but of memory. For the next 75 years, Forsyth County remained almost entirely white. Historians would later call it one of the most extreme sundown counties in the American South. Black families were not simply unwelcome. For most of the 20th century, they were effectively barred from living there at all. The story of 1912 wasn't taught, it wasn't discussed. For most of Georgia, it simply wasn't known. That changed briefly and loudly in January of 1987. Civil rights marchers organized a march for brotherhood through coming to confront the county's history head-on. The first march on January 17th was small, about 75 people, led by civil rights veteran Hosea Williams. They were met by roughly 400 Klansmen and white supremacists throwing rocks and bottles. Williams was struck in the head. Police called the march off. They could not guarantee anyone's safety. 1 week later, roughly 20,000 people returned, among them both of Georgia's U.S. senators and civil rights leader John Lewis, in what was called the largest civil rights demonstration since the 1960s. It took roughly 3,000 officers, including some 2,000 National Guard troops in riot gear, to keep the two sides apart. They marched through the same streets where the 1912 mob had gathered, 75 years earlier, to the day almost nobody in the crowd had ever been taught about. 2 weeks after that, Oprah Winfrey brought her talk show to Cumming, its first broadcast ever recorded outside her home studio. She sat with about 100 white residents to ask, on camera, why their county still had almost no black residents at all. The show had only been on the air 5 months. It became one of the moments that put it on the national map. For a few weeks, the whole country was looking at Forsyth County, and, without quite realizing it, looking at the same ground that would later disappear under a reservoir. Then the cameras left, and the story of Oscarville went quiet again for another 3 decades. The 1990 census, 3 years after the marches, recorded a total of 14 black residents in Forsyth County, 14, in a population of more than 44,000. The empty ground had held. 78 years after the wagons rolled out, the expulsion was still working. It wasn't until 2016, more than a century after the expulsion, that journalist Patrick Phillips published Blood at the Root. It was the first book-length account to connect the 1912 terror campaign directly to the county's modern reputation. By then, almost nobody driving across the Lake Lanier bridges on their way to a marina had any reason to know they were crossing over a buried town at all. Because by 1987, the physical evidence was already 29 years gone, sitting underwater that most people driving past had never once connected to any of this. The story of how it got there starts after the Second World War, when Atlanta began growing faster than its water supply could keep up with. The Chattahoochee flooded almost every spring, and Atlanta's population was climbing past 300,000 with no reservoir big enough to guarantee its water supply. In 1946, Congress authorized a new project on the Chattahoochee River, a dam for flood control, hydropower, and drinking water for the region. On March 1, 1950, the Army Corps of Engineers broke ground on Buford Dam, roughly 40 miles north of downtown Atlanta. Nearly 5,000 spectators turned out for the groundbreaking, speeches from Atlanta's mayor and Georgia's governor, and a ceremonial first blast. By the time it was finished, the main dam would stand 192 feet above the riverbed, a rolled earth wall 1,630 feet along its crest, backed by 3 saddle dikes running another 6,600 feet. Its powerhouse would carry 3 generating units, 2 rated at 60 megawatts each, plus a small service unit, a declared capacity of 127 megawatts. By June of 1951, over $2 million had already been spent on the project. Congress approved another $11 million in 1955 to finish it. But before the dam could hold anything back, the valley behind it had to be emptied again. More than 50,000 acres of farmland were condemned by the federal government, an area roughly the size of a small city, emptied by legal notice instead of fire. Over 250 families were ordered out of homes their families had worked for generations. 15 businesses were relocated. This time, it wasn't a mob doing the removing. It was paperwork, condemnation orders, survey stakes, government appraisers walking land that had been worked by hand for 100 years. 20 cemeteries were officially exhumed. The remains moved to higher ground before the water came. A stretch of state highway was abandoned outright. Gainesville's Looper Speedway, a local racetrack, was condemned and left standing where it was. A few pieces of the valley were judged worth saving. Van's Tavern, a log building standing since around 1805, was dismantled log by log in early 1956 and rebuilt at New Echota, far to the northwest. Whole roads simply stopped existing on the map. driveways that used to lead somewhere now led straight into open water. And at the north end of the valley, surveyors marked out what was left of the old Oscarville site for clearing, the same as every other parcel on their list. By 1950, almost no one remained there to object, negotiate, or even be notified. The crossroads that violence had emptied in 1912 was simply erased a second time on a federal map by engineers who likely never knew its name. Crews cleared trees and brush across the valley floor, but they didn't tear down everything. Some foundations, some roadbeds, some of the graves that were never relocated were simply left standing where they stood. February 1st, 1956. The sluice gates at Buford Dam swung shut. The Chattahoochee, which had run free through that valley for thousands of years, stopped moving. Water began climbing the banks. Inch by inch, it moved up the old roads into the old fields, over the old foundations nobody had come back for. For the better part of 2 years after the gates closed, the valley existed in a strange in-between state. Half-flooded fields, abandoned houses, a river slowly climbing over land that no longer belonged to anyone in particular. The dam was formally dedicated on October 9, 1957. Senator Richard Russell, Governor Marvin Griffin, and Atlanta Mayor William Hartsfield presiding. By August 1, 1958, the lake had reached full pool, 38,000 acres of standing water where a valley of towns used to be. At the dam itself, full pool puts 152 feet of water above the old riverbed. Somewhere under that water, at the bottom of what is now one of Georgia's most popular lakes, sit the remains of the crossroads where the violence began. Oscarville, never fully cleared, never fully accounted for. Today, Lake Sidney Lanier is Atlanta's front yard. Marinas, party coves, million-dollar homes lining a shoreline that used to be farmland. There are floating restaurants now, and a resort island, and neighborhoods where a house on the water can sell for 7 figures. Most of the 10 million people who visit every year have no idea the lake bed under their boat used to be roads, homesteads, and in at least one place, a graveyard. And Lake Lanier has earned another reputation, one that has nothing to do with 1912 and everything to do with what's still down there. Since 1994 alone, official records show at least 160 confirmed deaths on this lake. In 2016, 17 people died here in a single year, 9 drownings, 8 boating fatalities. Between 2011 and 2015, Lake Lanier accounted for nearly half of every drowning death recorded on any lake in the entire state of Georgia, one lake out of dozens. Compare it to Lake Allatoona, a similar-sized reservoir less than an hour away. Between 2005 and 2015, Lanier recorded 90 deaths to Allatoona's 45, almost exactly double, on waters that look, on the surface, the same. Lanier's death rate works out to about 1.2 deaths per million visitors. Allatoona's is 0.64. Both lakes get crowded, both lakes serve alcohol at their marinas. The one measurable difference between them is what's sitting on the bottom. Local news investigations and long-running public tallies put the lake's total death count, going back to 1956, at more than 700. No single agency has ever published one final, official number. Divers who work recovery calls on Lake Lanier describe a lake bed still tangled with old roadbeds, collapsed buildings, fences, and debris that was never cleared before the water came in. Hall County Sheriff Sergeant Chris Tampel, who has led dive team recoveries on Lanier for years, has called it one of the most dangerous things he's ever done. Zero visibility, cold, a lake bed of fine silt that turns to blinding cloud the moment a diver moves. When the lake was filled, crews left the trees standing below 35 feet. That 1950s forest is still down there, its branches strung with decades of lost fishing line instead of leaves. In December 2007, at the bottom of a historic drought, the lake fell to its all-time record low, 1,050.79 feet above sea level, roughly 20 feet down from full pool. The drought pulled the water back far enough to expose the old Gainesville Speedway's concrete foundation, stretches of abandoned roadway, and a one-lane road with its yellow center line still visible in the mud. Boats strike submerged foundations that shouldn't still be there. Swimmers get pulled down into structures nobody ever removed. The lake didn't just cover a landscape. In places, it preserved it dark, cold, and almost exactly as it was the day the water rose. Where a family once stood on a porch and watched the sun set over their own fields, a jet ski now idles, waiting for a friend to catch up. Neither one of them can see the other. That's the part water is good at. And then slowly, the story started coming back up. In October 2020, CNN ran a feature on the lake's deadly history and the ghost stories that had grown up around it. In 2021, the Oxford American published a long essay titled The Haunting of Lake Lanier, tracing the folklore back to the history underneath it. On TikTok, Haunted Lake Lanier became a running obsession, millions of views, most of them circling, without knowing it, a documented story. In 2024, a documentary series called Surviving Lake Lanier premiered on Prime Video, and it opened with Oscarville. And a research project called Lost Black Land Forsyth began tracing the county's 1910 tax rolls and deed books parcel by parcel, documenting exactly what black families owned there and what they lost. For decades, nobody went back for the graves at Oscarville. There was no marker on land and none beneath the surface. That finally started to change in September of 2021, the 109th anniversary of Rob Edwards' lynching. A historical marker was unveiled in downtown Cumming, a few hundred feet from where the jail once stood, placed there by the Equal Justice Initiative and a local remembrance project. It was unveiled by two of Rob Edwards' own descendants, Larry Knuckles and Leroy Grogan. 109 years later, someone finally said his name out loud, in public, on the ground where it happened. The marker stands on a downtown street corner, a few hundred feet from where the jail used to be. It says what the county spent over a century not saying. There is still no marker for Oscarville itself. Its exact site remains underwater, unmapped for the public, one more quiet corner of a lake 10 million people visit for fun. No plaque on any dock, no sign at any marina, nothing to tell a family setting up beach chairs that they are floating above what was once someone else's home. A community driven out by fire in 1912 was driven under by water in 1956, and for most of the 60-odd years since, its name was driven out of memory too. Every summer now, new visitors arrive with coolers and jet skis, standing on a shoreline that used to be somebody's front porch. Most of them will never hear the name Oscarville. The water was never required to explain itself. It just keeps doing what water does, filling in whatever space history leaves behind and holding its silence. Somewhere below the boats and the docks and the fireworks on the 4th of July, the fields are still there. The foundations are still there. In an unmarked corner of the lake, the dead are still there too. None of it asks to be remembered. It's simply waiting, the way water waits, patient and level, for as long as it takes. 114 years after the mob gathered in Cumming, and almost 70 years after the gates closed at Buford Dam, the two events are still, in the record, treated as separate stories. One about hate, one about infrastructure. Standing on the water today, it's hard to see them as anything but one story. This is Vanishing. Every place we cover has a reason it disappeared. This was ours to find and to say out loud.